Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Scholand. I work for the IEA 4E Technology Collaboration Program, TCP, and the Smart Sustainability and Lighting in Controls platform. We use the new acronym SSLC to refer to ourselves. And today we're going to be giving a presentation, the second in a series of 3 presentations about our solid state lighting review of health effects report that was published last month. And today we're going to be covering the circadian rhythms, acute neurobiological and long-term effects on solid state lighting on humans. And there will be one more presentation in this series tomorrow. So if you haven't already registered, please feel free. You can find the link on our website. It will be at the same time tomorrow, 21st of November. And with us today, we have Dr. Jennifer Veach, and I just have a little, she's going to be giving the whole presentation in this session. We'll be about an hour, about 40 minutes on slides and 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. And you'll notice at the bottom of your screens, you have a little button for questions. So you can enter questions at any time during the talk, and we will read those at the end and respond. Jennifer will respond to them. Or if you prefer, you can put your hand up at the end when we're in the Q&A section. I can unmute you, and then you can ask your question live. So if it's easier for you to describe your question or scenario that you're interested in. Okay, so without further ado, let me read you Jennifer's bio so you know the context of her background, and then I will hand over for her to speak. So Dr. Jennifer Veach is a psychological scientist with expertise in environmental psychology, and she's been a research officer at the National Research Council of Canada since 1992. She serves as the president of the CIE for the 2023-2027 term. So she is president now. She's a fellow of the National and International Associations in Lighting and Psychology. She received the Waldron Gold Pin for Applied Illuminating Engineering from the CIE in 2011 and the IES Medal Award in 2018. And in November 2024, this month, she was inducted as a fellow into the Royal Society of Canada. Congratulations on that, Jennifer.
Thanks,
okay,
Mike.
And I'm going to stop sharing now, and you can take over.
Okay. So through the magic of Zoom, you should be seeing my slides now.
Sorry, we are. It's perfect. Yep.
Good.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to take 1 second to close something so that someone tried to telephone me, which was inconvenient.
It always happens when you're live, doesn't it?
It does. There we go. Now anybody who calls me when I say do not disturb should know better. So you should see my slides, and credit is due to my colleague Sarah Loughran from the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Authority in Australia, who was co-author of the report and a co-developer of this slide deck, but who wisely chose to not expose herself to light in the middle of the night to give this presentation today. I'm going to give a few moments of explanation of why we did this report, and apologies to the people whose names I see on the participant list who I know were here yesterday. You'll hear this bit twice. We did this report as an update of what the former Solid State Lighting Annex did in 2014, 10 years, a lot of new information was out there. And also society had changed a bit in the incoming in that decade, to a shift to understand that we need to be more inclusive, we need to understand the needs of special populations, and we felt that it was important to update the report with a particular lens of looking at sensitive populations. So what we're trying to do is identify features of LED lamps and luminaires that can be improved to achieve better outcomes. And we did this for several audiences: the industry, regulators, and also public health authorities. And you'll see a lot weaved through this presentation, in which we're hoping that the message will get not just to the energy regulators, who are often the ones responsible for the adoption of LED lighting systems, but to the public health regulators, who really need some of this information to help people use light better for their health and well-being. And of course, being researchers, we have to give some information to researchers so that we can prompt some other work in filling in the gaps that we saw in the literature. Our scope, just so you know, is general lighting products, and including road and street lighting. Doesn't include automotive lighting, and it doesn't include light sources that are not lighting products. So for example, toys, displays, flashlights, anything like that. And credit to the international collaboration that was put together through the former Solid State Lighting Annex and now in the SSLC Platform. It's a group of really interested countries who are keen to promote the adoption of really well-designed and well-operated solid state lighting products. This particular report was, as I mentioned, a collaboration between Canada, Australia, but also France. Christophe Martensons from CSTB was really the lead author of the report. And the funding for that was from our 3 governments and also through the annex itself, so funds from all of the member countries. And what we did was to review the published literature in the intervening decade. So we didn't go back to the year dot. We started from 2014 as a base year, included published research papers if there were no reviews. And of course, we looked at standards and technical reports and other kinds of gray literature where that was appropriate. So on to the meat of the presentation. I'm going to start with some foundations. Many of you on this call may already know this, but because some of you don't, and it's important to understand this in order to understand what comes next, we're going to go through a little bit of fundamental science and then on into the meat of what the review talks about. So light detection basics. If you've taken any kind of education in lighting, and even if you've only taken junior high school biology, you've heard a bit about how the eye is structured. There are cells in the retina that detect light. And for about 75 or so years, maybe probably closer to 90 now, we've known about the cones and the rods. The cones are concentrated in the fovea of the retina. They detect high luminance, and they're important for color detection and image formation. The rods dominate in the periphery of the eye. They're important for image detection at low levels of luminance, so lower resolution because they're scattered across the whole retina, but they enable us to see, for example, when we're walking down the street dark, or even if you're getting up from bed and going into your own bathroom. What is really new is, well, new is a relative term. New to still to many people is the discovery 25 years ago of the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So light, when it passes through the eye and comes to the retina, actually passes through up from the top of this slide down to the layer at the back, which is where the rods and cones are. But then signals also go up to these ganglion cells, which historically had been thought to just be cells that collect information from lots of rods and cones. But the discovery in 25 years ago is that some of these ganglion cells are themselves able to respond to the presence of light or the absence of light. And they send signals up into higher brain functions, which I'll talk about in a second. They're not involved in image detection, these intrinsically photosensitive cells, but they do detect irradiance, so just the presence of light. And what do they do? Well, the cones and the rods we've known for many years are collecting signals through these ganglion and other specialized cells, and they send signals through the optic nerve, primary optical tract, which is the top part of this graphic, and send signals to the back of the brain, to the visual cortex, where visual processing happens. Part of the new discovery was the tracing of neural anatomy to recognize that there's also a path from the optic nerve through the retinohypothalamic tract, which goes through kind of a complicated set of locations that I won't describe, ends up with the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then sends a signal through some other structures to the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is important for a number of hormones, most particularly melatonin, which is a signaling hormone that tells the body when to stop and start different kinds of physiological processes. In darkness, in just about all vertebrates, melatonin is released. And so it triggers, even if the animal is one that is active at night, it triggers whatever the appropriate things are for that species and that time of day. In humans, it's one of the signals for time to go to sleep. It also has effects on the immune system, digestion, and other physiological processes. The SCN also has a lot of connections to other brain structures. And this is where you want to stay tuned for the coming years, because we don't yet know what the light signals that go to the SCN are important for in all of those other brain structures. So melatonin is well understood, largely because it's relatively easy to study. Cortisol, somewhat less well understood. There's a few studies that have looked at cortisol. All those other brain structures, much, much, much less well understood. So stay tuned for the coming years to understand how light affects those things. What's important to recognize, though, is that the light signals that are going through those different brain structures do so simultaneously. And so what that means is light influences everything all at once. And so it's incorrect to talk about circadian light, or even to think that if you're a lighting designer or an installer, you should only be paying attention to circadian rhythm effects as part of your lighting design. Because the people who are going to experience that light need light to do all those other things too. They need to have the ability to see their tasks, visual performance. I hope you want to create a good visual experience for them in whatever space they may happen to be. We want to avoid glare and create positive conditions of visual comfort, while also recognizing that depending on the time of day and the individual, we may also want more or less light in concert with their needs for circadian rhythm regulation, and that there are also some acute effects of the light, that is, effects that happen at the moment of the light or very shortly after the light exposure takes place. And all of those things are happening simultaneously because there's still only one person there, and all of those processes happen in parallel. And we have a word for that. The CIE has a definition of a term called integrative lighting, which integrates both visual and non-visual effects and produces physiological and psychological benefits for people. I suppose it could also create physiological and psychological costs, but the term and the definition are intended to be used in a positive way. What's important about this term is it encompasses the full range of psychological and physiological effects on people. It includes the necessary light-dark pattern, but it also includes those visual comfort, visual performance, and other effects that I mentioned. So it really is trying to integrate the whole thing and refocus our attention on the whole person that's experiencing a lighting system. The CIE also has published a standard which defines a metrology system for talking about these kinds of topics. CIE SO26, published in 2018, established quantities for assessing light exposures for the whole range of physiological and psychological effects of light, and especially those mediated by the IPRGCs. And what it's recommending is that particularly for scientists who want to understand these effects, they should be reporting quantities as they affect all 5 known types of photoreceptors, the rods, the 3 types of cones, the IPRGCs. And then, of course, because we also often are doing practical lighting that has to respond to various standards and recommendations, we would also report in terms of V lambda, the photopic luminescence, spectral luminous efficiency function. And what you see in this graph on the bottom left of this slide are all of those curves. And I've highlighted particularly in solid blue, the melanopic action spectrum. That's the action spectrum associated with the function of the IPRGCs, and V lambda. And one of the important things to note about that is they're not the same. So we can be assured that, in fact, there are these different classes of photoreceptors in the eye. And this evidence actually was part of the evidence chain that led scientists to be concluding that, in fact, the IPRGCs are a real thing and something we should pay attention to. But you'll notice there are also spectral sensitivity functions included in this standard for the long, that is the the L, the medium, the M cone, and the S cone curves as well as the rhodopic curve for low light levels. Now, the other thing to think about and important to keep in mind as I talk about some of the recommendations later in this presentation, is that when we're talking about light that's going to influence biology, we need to be thinking not about the light that's falling on some arbitrary surface in the space, so a desk surface or the road surface if you're considering outdoor lighting. For our purposes, what matters today is the amount of light that's reaching the eye. Now, usually we think about this as a vertical plane. So as if I'm sitting up straight enough in my chair, that's, vertical looking at the camera. But as you can see in this lovely diagram from Naomi Miller, sometimes that's at an angle. So you might be sitting in bed and looking down at your book or your tablet or whatever you're doing. And in that case, your plane of the eye is not vertical and it's not horizontal either. So we need to be thinking about what are the light levels going to be in whatever location we think the eye of a viewer is going to be. Now to think about how we calculate these new quantities, I have an example here to try to make it easier. And again, this is a credit from Naomi. I use a lot of graphics that I get from her. In this case, imagine for the moment that you have measured spectrally your light source and you've determined that the irradiance of the eye in the location of the viewer in your space looks like this one on the upper left. And it's an LED light source with a correlated color temperature of 3800, 3850 Kelvin. And you're particularly interested in your case in the melanopic irradiance. You might also be interested in any of the other, what we call alpha-opic irradiances, but for the moment, consider just melanopic. So you're going to take the IPRGC action spectrum, and you're going to multiply that for each wavelength by your spectral power distribution. And what that's doing is it's giving more weight to the wavelengths at which the IPRGCs are most sensitive. And the resulting spectral melanopic irradiance is going to look like the outcome on the bottom. And if you wanted to sum up and come up with a total for your melanopic irradiance, you would integrate over the values on all of those wavelengths. Bang, you're done. Now, that may seem very complicated. It's not. What you do have to have for this is spectrally resolved measurements at least the 5 nanometer intervals. 10 is not good enough. 5 nanometers, 1 nanometer is better if you can get it. But once you've got that, there are free online calculators available that can do the arithmetic for you. So that part's covered. Now, the standard SO26 also recommends a particular quantity as a valuable one in talking about what kind of light exposures we're giving. And what the committee writing the report, and I will say I was not part of the technical committee that wrote the standard, although I like the outcome they came to, they determined that because we're often trying to talk about practically relevant quantities, the sort of base case that they considered most relevant for this set of phenomena would be daylight. So they chose the CIE illuminant D65 as a representative daylight spectrum that would be the base case for comparing to. And what you can do is to take your irradiance of whichever quantity you're interested in. So alpha opic is just a shorthand for any of those 5 different types of quantity. You take the one you're interested, so say melanopic, and you would take your melanopic irradiance and you would compare it to using this formula to the D65 illuminant. And what that will do is it will give you a value in lux, just a regular lux is the unit, but it would give you the value in lux of the equivalent amount of D65 that would be required to give the same irradiance as your target. So that gives us a way to compare all the different kinds of quantities because it gives us a stable basis in equivalent daylight illuminance in lux for whatever values we're looking at. So that's what I'm going to be using as the quantity that I'll be describing some of the values later in this presentation. Okay, now for the meat of what you actually came to hear. What did we conclude about circadian and acute effects? So as you know, I think, excuse me, a lot of our physiology and behavior are determined by circadian rhythms. We're able to get up in the morning and go to sleep at night because one hopes we're nicely synced into a good rhythm of activity and sleep. And the daily pattern of light exposure is critical to setting these rhythms. Light is the most powerful zeitgeber for waking and sleeping and various other physiological functions. And that appropriate pattern of light exposure supports good quality sleep, and many physiological processes take place during sleep. So it's important for restoration, it's important for immune system function, it's important for memory consolidation. So that good night's sleep is it is about being rested, but it is not only about being rested. And that's why we have to be taking important steps to preserve sleep for everybody. But that also enables us to be alert during the day. And as I mentioned, it also cues the processes that are needed to maintain health and well-being throughout the organism, throughout the person. So there's a well-established relationship between circadian rhythm and sleep. Sleep is controlled by two processes, one of which is the circadian waking and sleeping cycle, which is maintained by a clock deep in the brain, and that clock is reset daily by light exposure. So that's where the light exposure is particularly critical. But there's a second process called the S process, which has to do with sleep inertia that happens in parallel, and it's less affected by light. It's, as I already said, light is what trains that circadian rhythm. So the C process of the CNS system for sleep is particularly tied into our daily exposure to light and dark. But the inappropriate light exposure, light that comes in the wrong amount at the wrong time of day, can disrupt those circadian rhythms, and it can disturb sleep onset and quality. So that's why all of us a few weeks ago felt a little bit disrupted when we had the clocks change. Whether you were in Europe or North America, it's still only a few weeks ago in the past. That sort of abruptly changed the timing of your daily light exposure, and that would be why you might have felt a little bit off for those few days immediately following that time change, or why you have jet lag when you travel a longer distance east or west. And there is some evidence that inappropriate light exposure also is connected to other effects. So neuroendocrine effects, metabolic and physiological effects. Now, it's not so clear that there's a direct effect of the light exposure on these other processes. However, we do know that these other processes are timed to work in concert with a very elaborate kind of pattern of peaks and valleys in their activity. And those are all sort of synchronized based on circadian clock. So there's a link, even if indirect, to circadian rhythms in these other processes. Some things are known with a very high degree of certainty. Light exposure in the evening can delay sleep and affect sleep quality. So last night when I gave the first edition of this presentation, I was giving a presentation after midnight my time. That definitely caused me to have not so much good sleep last night. It's a well-known phenomenon. But interestingly, it can be even worse if you're exposed to dim light and then exposed to some bright light in the evening. It can sort of multiply or add to a further delay to the circadian rhythm, be really disruptive. But on the other hand, being exposed to very bright light during the daytime can reduce the circadian rhythm sensitivity to that light in the evening and improve sleep quality. So there's things that people can do to try to manage their own daily light pattern to result in good sleep quality at the end of the day. Now, it's true that because these processes are largely mediated by the RPRGCs, and they're most sensitive in the short wavelengths with a peak at about 490 nanometers, so short wavelength light does have a bigger effect. If you were to sit in a fully blue room at 10 o'clock at night, that's going to have a very big effect on delaying your circadian clock, and you'll have more trouble going to sleep that night, as compared to sitting in a red room with equivalent irradiance, like equivalent amount of flux. Pardon me. That being said, all that means is you can have a slightly greater quantity, a slightly greater flux of long wavelength light than short wavelength light in the evening, with less effect on your circadian rhythm. And that's kind of a good thing because many of us do need more light in order to be able to see something we want to do in the evening. So we can choose our light source in the evening, and the level still matters, so that we have the ability to still do some things in the evening before we're ready to go to bed, without unduly affecting the quality of our sleep later. But the short answer to how to use light for effective nighttime sleeping is have very bright days and very dim nights. And that doesn't require a complicated formula for calculating exposures. It's just very bright days, very dim nights, keep a regular wake and sleep time, and you're probably good to go. If you're going to get down into the more nitty-gritty details, then you really need to be talking about the melanopic exposure quantities, because they are clearly the best exposure index. There's been some meta-analyses that have showed that this quantity is the best predictive quantity for these outcomes. But it's really important to recognize that you can give the same melanopic quantity with less energy if the spectrum is appropriately tailored. Or putting the other way around, it's possible to have a light source that has almost no short wavelength light and still have an adverse effect on nighttime sleep if you have a really high intensity light source. So if you still have incandescent lamps in your home, but you have a very high light level in the room you're in the evening, even though there's not much short wavelength light in those incandescent lamps, you can still be causing yourself problems with subsequent sleep, and you might want to dim it down. You'd be spending less energy, of course, if you had an even lower photopic light level with an LED source that was a slightly higher correlated color temperature. So there's different ways to get to the same place, because exposure is a matter of the spectrum of the light source and the amount of energy at each wavelength. Now, moving on to more daytime effects, more acute effects. Cognition and alertness is one that I've studied throughout my career, and many other psychologists have. And most of us, because it's the easiest thing to study, have looked at the intensity of light exposure. It's the most widely studied thing. Now, interestingly, self-reports and anecdotal evidence do tend to report increased alertness with light exposure. So if you ask someone using any of a number of different scales of alertness, you'll find that if you've exposed them to a higher versus a lower light level, they'll report a higher level of alertness in the higher light level. But physiological markers are very difficult to detect. Cognitive performance tests are also quite inconsistent. So it's not easy to say, oh, a higher light level is always better. And one of the reasons for that is that the effects may differ for simple versus complex tasks. And that's partly because a different level of arousal is thought to be appropriate for different tasks. So you might need, so it's not as simple as saying the, sorry, having trouble clearing my throat today. It's simply not a simple more light is better or less light is better. It's always a very complicated kind of answer to pick the right level. And of course, bearing in mind that for any practical installation, there are all those other factors that we're trying to simultaneously design for. Now that was during the day. If we shift to the evening, light exposure, we know in the evening and night have stronger effects on alertness. So in particular, if you wake someone up in the night and you expose them to light, then they will in fact become more alert than they would if you expose them to a lower level of light at night. But interestingly, there's also a seasonal variation which may be implicated. Particularly, it seems to be the case that in the autumn and winter, that there's a greater sensitivity to that light exposure. And it may be because in the spring and summer months, people are exposed to higher light levels, possibly because they're spending more time outside, or the day length is longer, so there's more availability of bright daylight. And as I hope most of you know, daylight is almost always an order of magnitude higher in intensity than the light levels we use interiors in buildings. I wish it were true, but we don't yet have the evidence that there's a difference between short, intense exposures and long, low intensity exposures. And that information would be very valuable because if we could get really strong physiological or psychological benefit out of short, intense exposures, then we could maybe use that as a way to save some energy. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. That's something that I think needs more research. Now, when well-being is concerned, it is a complicated phenomenon. Well-being is a phrase that um, some people use in different senses than other people use it, but I use it to mean a complete sense of subjective good feeling. So it can encompass some of the comfort measures that would be encompassed in visual comfort. It also can include a sense of being socially connected, being able to respond well to other people, feeling in a positive mood towards the world. There's pretty good evidence from a reasonably large number of exposure studies, even granting that many of them were back in the day when the only thing you could measure was photopic illuminance, that the average daily light exposure in Western societies or industrial societies is too low. And there's actually quite good evidence that a higher exposure to light during the day will lead to a greater sense of well-being. Unfortunately, higher doesn't mean that we have an accepted recommended level. It's not possible to say you must get at least X exposure during the day. Just that if it's a low level that you're getting and that's not working for you, you might want to consider increasing your light exposure in the day. That being said, it's a really difficult area to study. So the evidence for higher light exposure leading to more positive mood is not strong. And we don't even have a good handle on a good predictive measure for it. I was involved in a literature review in which we tried to determine that perhaps melanopic EDI would be a good predictor of positive mood, and unfortunately, we couldn't find that in the literature. And it's important to recognize that to achieve those well-being outcomes, again, we're trying to achieve a good balance. We might want a higher light exposure, but we don't want to do it in a way that's going to cause glare and discomfort. In that case, we've really not achieved good overall well-being. And we also need to provide for the visual needs of the person doing the task. So it is a very complicated job, which is why I am never going to be a lighting designer. Now, another aspect that people have looked at over the years is trying to use the spectrum of the light source, often expressed in terms of the correlated color temperature, as a way to kind of push ahead a goal of achieving good sense of vitality or well-being in people. The evidence for high correlated color temperature light sources, which generally have a higher level of short wavelength radiation in the spectrum, there's very poor evidence that those light sources achieve feelings of vitality and concentration. That's not just me, that's also a couple of really sound Cochrane reviews of that literature. And there's conflicting reports of the effect of this high CCT lighting on positive mood. And that can be because some of these very high CCT light sources interact with the objects in the space and they don't create as pleasant a visual experience. So it's not about the physiology connection to mood, it's about the visual appearance of the space. So we need to be keeping a balance between color appearance, color rendering, spectrum, and intensity, again, keeping in mind that the goal is integrative lighting, in which we pay attention to all of these parallel processes that are happening at once. The citations here on the slide are to work that our lab has done, in which we were looking at lighting conditions that people would perceive as being good. Now, we weren't particularly focused on the IPRGCs. In fact, we did this work really before it was as solidly into consideration as it is today. But what we were interested in at the time was the distribution of light, the intensity of light in the space, and the ability to have some personal control over the intensity, because there are really large individual differences in preferences just for the intensity of light. And what we found that was when people were in a lighting condition that they perceived to be good, they were experiencing better mood, better well-being, and a stronger work focus. And so these are not effects that I would strongly think have any relation to the IPRGCs per se, but they are processes that happen in people when they are in spaces. So there's good reason to think about how we can use light for well-being that may or may not be triggered by what people are most excited about these days, which is the IPRGCs. However, when we consider effects that are likely or thought to be influenced by the IPRGCs, we do know that a morning light exposure has a more consistent relation with improved mood than afternoon exposure. That's based on the literature we have to date. I will say there's some interesting new studies coming out in which the focus has been on early afternoon exposure, and those are so new that they didn't make it into our report. There is, however, some evidence that bright light is better tolerated in the morning and the afternoon than in the evening. And that kind of makes sense, given that we know that the evening light is also having these unwanted effects on our subsequent sleep. And there's not a lot of evidence at the moment for the effect of light exposure duration on mood. So we don't know that a short duration or a long duration or the Goldilocks solution of a medium duration is better than any other time. That's another open area that researchers could look at, but an important one, which the importance of which will become clear when I go on to the next slide. So at the moment, there is a current expert consensus on light exposures. It comes from a workshop which 18 experts, of which I was not one, met in Manchester in 2019, convened by Rob Lucas and with the involvement of his colleague Tim Brown. And what these experts did was to review the literature that was available at the time in what's called a meta-analysis. So they pulled lots of information together into one analysis, particularly focusing on three outcomes: self-reported alertness, melatonin suppression, and circadian phase shifting. And based on that literature, they came up with these recommendations for a healthy day-night pattern of light exposure. The recommendations are that during the day, you want a minimum of 250 lux of melanopic EDI at the eye. And I'll tell you that that is a very difficult target to reach without using daylight. Certainly most interior lighting recommendations these days will not get you there. And of course, there's a potential there for some conflict because installing more lighting equipment or increasing the intensity of the lighting that's already in an installation could run afoul of various energy regulations. So there's definitely some need there for additional research to pin down what's really needed, and then going to be some needed consideration of how are we going to do that in a design sense. Now, shifting to the evening, the recommendation is that for 3 hours before your bedtime, you should really dim that down, a maximum of 10 lux of melanopic EDI. And again, that's a challenging level to get down to, especially for people who may need more light to do tasks or to read a book or what have you. And that's where some spectral attention may be really valuable because you could deliver a higher photopic illuminance on a task while keeping the melanopic illuminance at the eye at a lower level. So there's some ways to play with spectrum and intensity and location, like the distribution of the light, in order to do that. And then when sleeping, I can't actually even show a slide of the sleeping environment because it would just be a black square. So we have to have a photo with one light on it. But when you're sleeping, that light should be off because you want less than 1 lux melanopic EDI at the eye. So probably a horizontal or slightly inclined plane where the eye is in the bed. And that's what you need for sleeping. So that's the day-night pattern. The important thing about that pattern is it gives us a sense of what's the difference between dark overnight and bright during the day. And that's the expert consensus of the moment. Now, there's some caveats to it. The Brown et al. Recommendations were based on research with healthy young adults. And as we know, the population is not dominated by healthy young adults. So we know there's lots of other groups of people for whom we have not really enough information. We don't know very much about what's needed for older adults, for adolescents, for children, for babies. And another important population is one that's formed really by behavior, not by their personal characteristics. And those are people who need to work shifts, whatever shift they may work, if it's overnight or in the evening or what have you. And we also noted in the report particularly that we need some special attention to the patterns of light exposure that are required for people who don't have their own control over their daily light exposures. And these are people who, for one reason or another, either can't get around very much. They may be hospital patients. They could be residents in a long-term care home, or they could be people who are in prison. And prisons are actually a particular interest of mine because they're such a complicated place. You have the security needs of the staff and the need for staff overnight to be alert and awake. But at the same time, those who are incarcerated should have a right to sleep in darkness. And there's a real conflict there between the needs of those two groups. It's really an interesting dynamic to be discussed there. And we don't yet have a good handle on how to do that kind of complicated setup that simultaneously can meet the needs of different groups of people. There are also some important research gaps that we noted in the report. Among these are non-visible wavelengths. So that's both ends of the spectrum, lower than 380 nanometers and higher than 780 nanometers. There is much yet to be learned. Particularly in the near infrared region. There's some new research coming out that suggests that that might be important for health and well-being. And as of course, many of you know, an LED light source is generally designed to exclude all of those wavelengths for energy reasons. So we need to know more about that because we may be conducting a large natural experiment on ourselves and excluding something that we may later wish we had included. There is possibly some exposure, some evidence that ultraviolet radiation may have some beneficial effects, but that has to be really carefully adjusted because we know it has some very significant risks attached to it as well. And so there's a dynamic there still to be determined. And we really have totally inadequate information about individual differences in sensitivity. We know that these exist because of other studies, but we haven't really studied them very much with respect to the action of the IPRGCs. Anybody who's done the research on melatonin knows that there's wide individual differences in the levels, the amplitudes of melatonin rhythms, but we don't yet know why one person is one way or another or what the needs of those different groups might be. Now, shifting to long-term effects, these are effects that emerge not immediately and not because of circadian rhythms, but because of our long-term exposures to light. The first of these is myopia. It is actually not just a matter of, oh dear, you need to wear glasses, but severe myopia increases the risk of some really nasty sources of vision loss, retinal detachment, dense cataract, and glaucoma, among other things. So it's an important public health problem, and it's increasing in occurrence, particularly in East Asia, where at the moment 80 to 90% of high school graduates have quite serious myopia. What's interesting, though, is that there is pretty good evidence that you can prevent myopia in children by having them spend more time outside during a critical window of years between about ages 3 and 9 or so. And that has to do with is thought to have to do with the effect of the very intense exposure from daylight influencing dopamine release in the eye, which influences the growth of the eyeball. It does appear that short wavelength exposures might be protective of this. And so it may be the blue and the violet that are most influential in this process. However, interestingly, there are also some effective treatments that use long wavelength exposures. So there's some puzzles there yet to be answered. But what's important to know is that there is no evidence that any particular electric light source is a cause of this myopia epidemic. In fact, it's more likely the case that the cause is simply too much time indoors at relatively low light levels and not enough time outdoors. So recess is always a good thing. At the other end of the age range, there's age-related macular degeneration. It's also a serious source of blindness, especially in industrialized countries. It's a significant, major source of it for people over age 50. Now, it has a number of known risk factors that don't involve light: age, smoking, genetics, hypertension, so forth. But there is some evidence that long-term exposure to very bright intense short wavelength light could be one factor. There's some similarities to the way AMD develops and the blue light hazard spectrum. So there's some similarities there, but it's not completely clear how that process may work. And we can't really conclude anything about electric light contributions to those overall exposures. And my final long-term effect that I'm going to discuss concerns cancer risk. This is largely an indirect effect. We know that the PRGCs send the signals that are critical to stopping and starting melatonin, and it's an important hormone in many kinds of processes, and it's an important antioxidant as well. So there have been a number of studies that have demonstrated that disrupted melatonin secretion is associated with tumor growth, and we know that acute exposure to light at night, for example, will suppress melatonin release. So that's one factor that can disrupt your melatonin secretion. It's not the only one, however. There's an interesting evidentiary chain that includes the evidence that people who work night shifts for many, many years are known to have higher cancer risk. They also have other unfortunate health consequences, and other things go on for people who work night shifts for a long time. They tend to have a poor diet, they tend not to have enough sleep, they tend not to exercise enough, and they may have other occupational hazards. So for example, they could be firefighters. What we also know on the flip side to that is that having a strong light-dark rhythm reduces cancer risk. So we can't associate any particular product or system in this risk. And the protective mechanism for all of us is to maintain that strong daily night-dark rhythm. So what does this all mean for policy? Well, we have two categories here, one for the circadian and the acute effects. And really what we want to talk about here is optimizing our lighting scenarios and our individual light exposures. So there's role here for public health people to try to help individuals, not people who are so specialized that they're on this call today, but your grandmother and your neighbor, to understand that they need a strong daily light-dark pattern for their best health. The easiest way to get this is to increase daylight exposure, get a high melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance exposure at the eye during the day for as long as possible. If we're going to use solid state lighting, which of course we are, in our homes, in our institutions, in the evening and at night, you want to try to minimize the melanopic EDI for people who are active during the day. And that, of course, leads into the more complicated discussion that we can't have today about how do we optimize that for the shift worker, for example, the nurse in the hospital who needs to stay awake overnight versus the patient who needs a good night's sleep in order to heal. Complicated problem, not today's talk, thank goodness. So that's optimizing the light exposure at the right time for good effect. We also need to think about reducing the intensity of the exposure at the wrong time. In fact, that's probably not the right headline for myopia, because in that case, we really want to increase the exposure by day for children in that, particularly in that critical growth window. But again, the message there is quite similar. Get outside, use daylight as much as possible. For age-related macular degeneration, we've suggested in the report that as a precaution, people should avoid repeated direct exposures to high intensity light if they can do that. But again, this is a very long-term problem. So this is, your whole adult life, not just a few weeks to try to prevent a problem. It's a general pattern of behavior. Wearing sunglasses, for example, becomes a good idea. And I note that even wearing sunglasses outside, you can still get a high enough melanopic EDI during the day for the good effects, while also protecting yourself against some of the bad effects. And with respect to cancer, we really need to be focusing on people taking personal responsibility for that strong daily light-dark rhythm. The exposure to light, for example, in a workplace is important. It's a major source of the time that we spend every day. However, the whole day pattern is what matters. So people need to be aware of what they're being exposed to, and they need to be taking steps to get that very strong daytime exposure and that very dim evening and nighttime exposure. We do suggest in the report that authorities should reconsider their exterior lighting requirements, and this is a bit complicated. Again, multiple needs. We want roadways to be safe to drive on. However, we also want to avoid obtrusive light where people are experiencing stray light into their bedrooms that's interfering with their need for a dim light overnight. So there's some balance to be achieved there, and we would like to see a little more consideration of those competing needs. To wrap up, sensitive populations, our policy recommendation is to try to increase the amplitude of the day-night rhythm with an increased daylight level. There's lots of evidence, for example, that less light gets to the back of the eye as we age and our lens is yellow, so we're going to need that extra high light exposure to get that very bright day, very dark night kind of pattern. For children and adolescents, we probably need to be focusing more on reducing the light levels in the evening and night so that they get that good night's sleep. Shift workers is a really complicated problem. There is no easy answer for them at this time because it's a complex combination between the particular shift schedule they work and the light exposure during those shifts, especially for places where they use a rapidly rotating shift, where people are pretty much in a constant state of circadian dysregulation because they're working a day one day and then an evening the next day and then a night the next day, and the poor circadian clock doesn't know what to synchronize to. And the last word, particularly because this is the focus of this report was solid state lighting, we want to emphasize that light is a flux of photons, and every photon has its own energy and momentum, and that is what determines its interactions with matter. These effects are technology agnostic. It doesn't matter what the source of that photon is, if it's the sun, if it's an incandescent light, if it's an LED light, that doesn't matter. What does matter is the energy attached to that photon, so where it is on the electromagnetic spectrum, how many of them there are, so in terms of the total flux, the timing, and also the pattern of light that that individual has experienced over the course of the day. So we want to emphasize that although this was a report of the Solid State Lighting Annex, and that now the Smart Sustainability and Lighting and Controls Annex, the effects that we're talking about here are in fact technology agnostic. And I want to thank you, and when you get the slides, you'll have our email addresses for any questions that you may want to send later, although we do have some time for questions today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a great summary. And yeah, I just encourage all of the participants on the line now to think of some questions that you can enter into the Q&A box, or if you prefer, you can simply raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask your question live. So we have one question. It's a three-part question. All right. You may want to read along with me here, Jennifer. So,
Yep.
so Tapio is asking, well, maybe we'll do one at a time. How are the photosensitive ganglion cells, IP-RGCs, located in the retina?
So that's an interesting question because there are different points of view. There is some evidence that they're located throughout the retina, but there is also some evidence that they may be spatially, not uniformly spatially distributed. And so some evidence might suggest that they're sort of concentrated on the lower part of the retina, so the light coming from above might be more likely to trigger them. But I have not seen. I am personally not convinced that those differences are significantly great to matter to practical lighting installations, because we know that people look many places throughout the day, and there may be different people with different tasks looking at different locations. So, I may stand corrected by future information, but at the moment, I don't think that level of detail is going to make a critical difference to lighting installations.
Okay. Next part of Tapio's question, does the amount of light reaching the retina depend on how large an area in the field of view the light comes from. For example, from one of many small light sources or from a large area, if the illuminance on the vertical surface of the eye is the same.
That's a good question, and it relates to the first one, of course. Um, and I would have to say, I don't think we know at this point. And then I would refer back to my previous answer, which is I'm not sure it matters from a practical perspective, because when we're in an installation or in a room, for example, um, we're not looking at the light source, we're looking at the things in the room. And we're concerned with other aspects of the lighting installation as well, like the visual appearance of the space or the tasks we're trying to do. So that level of precision might matter if you were trying to use light for therapeutic purpose. But I think from a lighting installation perspective, that's probably more detail than we need to worry about.
Okay. And the last part of Tapio's question, and in CIE's recommendations, the melanopic EDI value should be more at least 250 lux throughout the day, measured in the vertical plane. Is the light in the morning not enough to synchronize the internal clock?
Um, well, it's not just about the light in the morning, because you would have to have the bright morning and the dim night to get the synchronization working. Um, the bigger implication of your question is one that's not yet known. And I assume that you say in CIE's recommendations, you're referring to the recent position statement that was released last month, which of course is not referenced in the report we're talking about today because it didn't exist then. Although those recommendations are also in the Brown paper that was the source of them. One of the things that the CIE noted in its position statement is that although the Brown et al. Recommendations are for 250 lux melanopic EDI all day, we don't know if a shorter period of a brighter exposure would have the equivalent effect, so that we don't have to achieve that 250 lux continuously for every minute of the waking day. That's simply an open question. We don't know yet. I hope that it's actually not true that we need 250 melanopic lux consistently every minute all day, because from an energy perspective, that's going to be a very hard thing to achieve.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And Tapio, if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box or raise your hand. Chris Sorensen asks, is anyone working on a low-cost MEDI sensor to gather exposure data in substantially higher quantities?
So the first thing I'm going to do is say, please don't use the word MEDI because it's not a word. Say melanopic EDI. That's just kind of a side note. To answer your question, I know that there are a lot of groups that are working on a lot of different exposure sensors. There's a EU-funded project called Melidose that is working on different kinds of recommendations related to exposure measurement. There's also a CIE Joint Technical Committee, JTC 20, I think it is, that it's trying to provide guidelines and best practice for that. I do know there are some low-cost sensors out there. Well, low is a relative word, but lower cost sensors out there of varying quality. But I'm not going to be an advertisement for any particular product today.
Okay, and Chris appreciated your joke about Medi and wrote ha 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 in a follow-up comment. Christian Freimuller asks, is there a difference known, for example, in sleep quality between populations beyond the Arctic Circle and closer to the equator? Is sleep quality better in some parts of the world? Yeah.
So the answer is, well, my answer is I don't know. There may be studies out there that have looked at that, but I don't know. I have done one study, which is available on the NRC website, in which we looked at light exposure in people extremely far north in Canada. And we did find that people who had a higher light exposure had better sleep. But that was still because of where it was and the fact that it was the middle of winter, there was no daylight. And because it was so cold, they spent all of their time indoors. So that was still not achieving anywhere near, 250 lux, which wasn't a recommendation that we knew about at that time. So it's complicated. I think it's possible to have good quality sleep if you have a good daily light dark pattern, even if that pattern is not as large an amplitude as might be optimal. But sleep's very complicated. So there's a lot more to be learning there.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Next question is from Sophie Perry. So Sophie asks, how likely in practice are people likely to get the required melanopic dose via electric lighting if they have to move their head, move around generally in an appropriate lit workspace such as an office, assuming there is insufficient daylight?
So the answer is not very likely at all. Um, I happen to be sitting right next to a window, so I get lots of daylight, even on a cloudy day like today. But my colleagues nearer to the core of the building get almost no light exposure, daylight exposure, and a much lower light level. It's really difficult to achieve. That being said, um, there's some other interesting evidence. This is quite an old study um, in which Anna versus Justice in Basel, um, at the time when people were really excited and interested in looking at treatments for seasonal affective disorder, she did an experiment in which some people did morning phototherapy with a light box, and other people walked around Basel at noon. And another group, I think, got exercise, but not outside. And they found that walking around Basel at noon, and this was in the winter, it's apparently very cloudy there in the winter, um, was actually an effective treatment for the seasonal affective disorder. Now, it could be partly because of the exercise. It could be partly because I think they were walking together as a group, but it could also be because they were increasing their light exposure by walking outside at the most bright part of the winter day. So we can compensate somewhat for that lower level in our electrically lit interiors with periods of exterior daylight exposure. That's not factored into these consensus standards at this moment. And that's something where I think we need more evidence to know exactly how to do that. Um, and that's where I personally come down on the side of yes, very bright light during the day, and we should strive to get as close to that 250 melanopic EDI in the places where people are spending the most time. So in the office space, not the washroom. Um, but in terms of balancing the energy needs and the visual comfort needs, it would be really helpful if we could figure out if that really is a requirement that we have a continuously high light exposure. I think the exposure duration versus intensity equation needs a lot more investigation.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Two more questions have just come in. So Tapio has a follow-on. He asks, I've often heard the argument that people who live in warm countries prefer cool light and people who live in cold countries prefer warm light. Is there any basis for that argument?
I've heard that argument too, and I'm not sure I believe it. I don't know of any evidence for it, and I think it's important to recognize that, for example, parts of Japan are very cold, especially in the winter, and it's well known that people in Asia do have a higher, well, their purchase data shows that they have a higher use of more cold or higher correlated color temperatures. So I think we can easily find counterfactuals to that statement.
I have some experience looking at the market for compact fluorescent lamps and LEDs, and I think the market data speaks to that, at least for some countries. And in India, for example, the most common color temperature is 6,500 Kelvin, whereas in North America and Europe, it's definitely 2,700 Kelvin. So it could be what you're raised with and what you find familiar, but
Except,
and Africa actually has a lot. I've seen 12,000 Kelvin on lamps in Africa that we've measured. It's definitely above 5,000 is much more common in Africa.
on the other hand, what that also does, because what they're replacing would be incandescent, which was warm. If you replace it with something with a higher correlated color temperature, you're showing the world that you can afford to and you have adapted to this new modern light source. So there's lots going on there. I think it's more complicated than just, oh, I prefer this, or oh, there's some sort of intrinsic relationship between outdoor temperature and color temperature preference.
I, I see. Yeah, if there's anyone on the call who's from industry who would like to comment on that market aspect, please feel free to put your hand up or enter a comment. I'll just go to Sophie Just's comment. What about blue light filters for glasses or display? Any evidence of their UTI effects?
Um, I'm not sure what you mean by UTI effects, or okay, of their effects. I'm going to assume is
Oh,
what you
just
meant.
effect. Okay,
Yeah. Um,
their effect.
the short answer is no. I have seen some data that suggests that actually it's very much buyer beware. Um, there are a lot of products out there that are marketed to do blue light filtering, and some of them actually don't filter even what they say they filter. So that would certainly contribute to inconsistent results for people. Um, but really, um, it's about the overall intensity. And so if you were to, um, well, you wouldn't particularly want to filter out the blue all the time because that's going to affect the appearance of objects. It's going to make it more difficult, for example, to discriminate between the blue and the black socks in your drawer. Um, and I don't think the amount of filtering that you would get, even from a good blue filter, is going to be sufficient to compensate for the overall intensity that you're experiencing at night. Although I recognize there's some competing information about, for example, uh, products that change the spectrum of output, for example, for a tablet or a display. There's some mixed evidence on that.
Okay, thank you. John McHugh has a couple questions here. I think they might be linked. Does the research imply architectural solution of having high daylight exposure areas in break rooms, cafeterias, etc., or is the jury still out on short duration exposure for synchronization of circadian rhythms?
Um, your second statement is the right one. The jury is still out. And this is something even that we debated in there's a ISO CIE standard that's currently out for its final ballot. And we had a discussion about how, if at all, to integrate these consensus recommendations into that document and what spaces they might be relevant to. But we couldn't really find a simple rubric for how to do that. In the case of that standard, we landed on focusing on exposures in places where people spend the most time to come closest to the recommendation, which was constantly at 250 melanopic EDI, and not to overlight places where people are traveling through, so a corridor or a washroom and that sort of thing. But really, we need more information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Cosmin has asked a question here. Thank you, Jennifer, for a great presentation. Because melanopic EDI recommendation is defined for the vertical plane at the eyes and cannot capture what luminous distribution in the field of view, some researchers state there is a need for a new metric that can factor in spatially resolved sensitivity. Do you have a specific view on this? Thank you.
In some ways, it comes down or comes back to an age-old discussion about whether we should be writing recommendations for luminance or illuminance. And it's difficult because a designer, a lighting designer can't necessarily control what someone's going to do with, repainting a wall later. It's much easier to say, make sure there's this much falling on the wall or falling on the desk or even falling in this location. than it is to talk about the luminance of the surface when they don't control the surface. I'm not persuaded that we need more new quantities, but I'm open to evidence that of quantities that would make sense. I think I don't think we're at the point there of posing new ones. In fact, we're still trying to explain to people what we mean by melanopic EDI, and it's been around now for 6 years.
Great. Just to say, Cosmin, if you want to ask a follow-on to that or offer your own view, please feel free. Put your hand up. And then I have a few comments here or questions from Mark Yaraz. Now we see a change starting in industry from neutral and cold whites to warm whites. People were choosing colder LEDs due to the higher lumen per watt. It would be interesting to really replicate the sun spectrum as much as possible for healthy environments. That's a question, sorry. Would it be interesting to really replicate the sun spectrum as much as possible for healthy environments? We can create the same spectrum with UVB A plus visible plus IR plus FIR nowadays. And then he writes, at the end, being outside gives us 15 to 20 kilolumens, while inside we are maximum 1 kilolumen.
Right. So there's a couple of aspects to that. One is one would need to be extremely careful with the UV components. I'm not convinced that we want to be adding UV continuously to our interior lighting sources, not least because we would need a lot more stable dyes for our fabrics and other materials to avoid the fading, leaving aside, of course, the obvious health risks to people. So I'm pretty conservative on that end of things. I do think that we need more evidence related to the value of including near infrared and possibly far infrared, although jury's kind of out on that. We don't want to get into the point of causing thermal effects. I do think we need more evidence on that. There are studies that show therapeutic benefits of long wavelength radiation. There are a couple of studies. In fact, I have one that's coming out in collaboration with many other people very shortly. But we're not at the point of knowing how much is really valuable to add back in. And as you note, there is no way to practically get to the intensity of radiation indoors that we get outdoors. And really, in another sense, why would we? You can either go outdoors or do better daylighting, and you get it for free with fewer energy consequences. Obviously, not none. Nothing's free. So I think what we need really to be working towards is a better balance of electric lighting and daylighting, but a better understanding of what we need in our electric lighting. And right now, I am not persuaded that the best indicator for interior lighting of its, well, certainly not of its quality, but that the best indicator even for its value to an energy system is lumens per watt, because lumens really privilege the long and the medium wavelength cones and exclude all of the other photoreceptors. So if we design our light sources to maximize lumens per watt, well, I mean, the theoretical maximum for that would be 673 lumens per watt, but it would be green. No one would want to work in that. But then we would be excluding everything else. We wouldn't be able to see because there would be no color discrimination. And we are starting to see, as I said, some evidence that maybe those longer wavelengths have other value to us beyond vision. So we need a discussion about what a light source should be doing for us. And then we need to be looking at how do we do that in an energy efficient way, which probably means better controls, not delivering the highest possible light level all the time, because there is this energy need. We need to balance these different things better than we're doing right now, I think.
And maybe even a follow-on question to that one. Paulo asks, how is well-being defined and measured? Is it based on mood? How is mood defined or quantified?
Well-being is a complicated concept that actually has many ways of slicing and dicing it. There is no single I'm going to say quantity, although I don't mean that in quite the same way that a metrologist does, that one would point to and say, this is my measure of well-being. Mood is a more transient phenomenon. So am I feeling happy or sad in this moment? Whereas my overall state of well-being encompasses all the parts of my life. It's can include whether I feel a sense of social well-being and connected to people around me. Do I feel isolated? Do I feel capable? Do I feel vital in the sense of being able to be physically active? All of these things come together in a sense of well-being. There are a number of questionnaires that assess this kind of overall well-being, but no single one that I can point to say, use the Smith and Jones questionnaire. It's a little more variable than that.
Great. Okay. And that was our last question. So unless there's any others, maybe feel free to put your hand up or enter to the chat. Otherwise, maybe we'll call this a wrap. Just a little bit over
Right.
time, but it was a very good Q&A session. So thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you, Jennifer, for giving the presentation. It was excellent, and I will be posting both the recording of this webinar as well as a PDF copy of the slides on our website on Friday, and everyone who's registered for this webinar will receive a link to that page when I have it live. So yeah, you can watch it again and enjoy it a second time. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Hey,
Good day. Good evening.
bye-bye.
Bye now.